Hello, welcome to Bible Study. I'm Chaplain Harold Epley. I'm glad you're tuning in today. We are continuing our weekly Bible study here at East Castle Place using the book Dancing in the Aisle, Spiritual Lessons We've Learned from Children, a book that was written by my wife, Rochelle Melander, and myself a number of years ago. And we've been using this to help guide us in our Bible studies. We always look at a scripture passage and then think about how the theme that we're exploring applies to our own life. And there's always some discussion questions that I leave you with to think about throughout the week. And the topic that we have today is actually the one that is the title of the book. It's Dancing in the Aisle, and perhaps you wondered what that title is referring to. Well, it's referring to a story about a little girl who danced in the aisle, even though she wasn't supposed to. And that's what the theme is about today. As adults, sometimes we worry an awful lot about what other people think of us. And, maybe that starts when we're in our teenage years and middle school, and, you start being very important to want to fit in and be popular. And maybe even if you're not that kind of person, the reality is that we all feel a certain amount of peer pressure in life. Society has sort of unwritten rules. Some of them are written rules about how we ought to behave, and certainly a lot of those rules are appropriate and good. But sometimes they can be sort of the unspoken rules about what it means to be popular, or what it means to be considered great in terms of the world. And those don't always fit in with what Jesus is calling us to do. If you remember stories about Jesus over and over again, he sort of broke the rules, the conventional rules about things like you shouldn't hang out with certain types of people, or you shouldn't be doing certain things at certain times. And Jesus, as we know, hung out with all kinds of people, including those who were called sinners in the scriptures. So Jesus was able to kind of have that spontaneous love that we sometimes see in children, that sometimes we lose as adults. So that's what we're going to be looking at, and we're going to start with a Bible passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, which tells one of those stories about Jesus hanging out with what would be considered the wrong kind of people. And Jesus just is able to see beyond some of the unwritten rules of the society of his time. I begin at verse 3. It says, "While Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard. And she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on Jesus' head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, 'Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Therefore I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her.'" So a story there about this woman. She's not mentioned who she is in this particular story. In some other versions, she's described as being Mary Magdalene. But whoever she was, very quickly the people who were there criticized her for what she did. And Jesus jumped into her defense and said, "She has done this extravagant, wonderful thing for me. Why are you criticizing her?" Well, we'll reflect on that a little bit more as we read the devotion, Dancing in the Aisle. A few years ago, we attended a service at a small church in the country. When the congregation began to sing, a little girl with bouncing curly brown hair and a twirling red skirt rose from her seat. headed for the center aisle and began to dance. With arms lifted high, this tiny creature spun and kicked and swayed to the hymn. And as she danced, her face beamed. It wasn't just the smile. It was how her eyes sparkled and her skin glowed. The child's heart seemed to be filled with pure joy. Almost as soon as the girl began to dance, her mother whispered repeatedly, "Eva, come back here. Sit down." But the girl with the bouncing hair kept dancing. Finally, the mother stomped into the aisle, grabbed the girl's hand, and led her out of church. On another occasion, we were walking in the mall, pushing our 9-month-old son Samuel in his stroller. Samuel was giggling, enjoying the ride, enthralled by all the people who were passing by. When we stopped to look in a store window, he began to fuss, annoyed by the sudden lack of movement. A young girl, her brown face surrounded by braids held together with a rainbow of barrettes, walked up to Samuel and kissed his pale bald head. She patted his tiny hand and said, "Don't cry, little baby." Samuel cooed at her. He forgot his tears as he flirted with his new friend. Then the girl's father appeared. "Shayna, don't go kissing other people's babies," he said, as he pulled Samuel's new friend away. The father headed toward the other end of the mall, dragging the little girl behind him. As they left, Shayna turned and in a final affectionate gesture raised her hand to her lips and blew a kiss to Samuel. The gospel writer Mark told about a woman who, like Eva and Shayna, was chastised for her extravagant behavior. In the story I just read to you, according to Mark, this woman entered the house of Simon the leper and dumped costly perfume on Jesus' head as a sign of affection for him, a sort of goodbye gift before his impending death. The dinner guests scolded her. They made the very practical suggestion that the perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor. Instead of agreeing with their politically correct notion, Jesus commended the woman's action. He said, "Wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Now the text left out much of the details. The woman was not named, and the text did not reveal how the unnamed woman decided to anoint Jesus. One fact, though, is clear. Those dining with Jesus deemed the woman's act to be extravagant in the truest sense of the word. Extravagant comes from a word that literally means to wander beyond bounds. We live in a world that is concerned with boundaries and rules. At some point in our lives, most of us have learned that doing anything outside the norm is seen as strange or wrong. No doubt, boundaries and rules serve an important function in our society. They help to keep order. Part of the process of growing up is learning appropriate social behavior. However, as adults, we sometimes become so conscious of society's restraints that our impulses to act lovingly can be squelched before they are even born. Like Eva's mother and Shayna's father, we may become embarrassed and ashamed when we witness uncensored love and affection. Sometimes we fear the reproach of others. Perhaps Eva's mother worried that the other worshipers might complain. And maybe Shayna's father feared that we would be upset by a stranger kissing our baby, passing her toddler germs to our new child. Ascribe once asked Jesus, which commandment was the first of all? Jesus' response held this basic message: love God with all your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, love extravagantly. In his own life, Jesus demonstrated what he meant. When he healed on the Sabbath, when he touched people who were considered to be unclean, when he forgave sinners and dined with them, Jesus loved in ways that broke down boundaries and challenged the normative standards of his day. Clearly, both Eva and Shana hadn't lived long enough for society's rules of proper public conduct to be embedded in their minds. They were still young enough to act with loving impulses. In their moments of passion, as they listened to their hearts, they fulfilled Jesus' command to love God and others in ways that challenge social boundaries. Sometimes it takes folks from the very edge of society, children and an unnamed woman, to challenge our obsession with the rules of proper conduct and to breathe grace and joy and freedom into our lives. Sometimes we need to witness the kiss of a little girl wiping away the sadness of a crying baby in order to envision a world without so many boundaries. Some days we need to see a child dancing in the aisle to encourage us to follow our hearts. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus really gives us a model of how to love. And we mentioned in here, love extravagantly. He says, love God with your whole heart and soul and mind. Love as deeply as you can. Love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus is really calling us to love in ways that pay no attention to the boundaries and norms of society. We mentioned in here how Jesus demonstrated that. He often broke the rules. He healed on the Sabbath. He was criticized by the Pharisees because on the Sabbath day you were to do no kind of work, and to them that included anything, including his act of healing. But Jesus saw it differently. He said, healing is a good thing to do any day. So why do we worry about whether it's the Sabbath or not? Another example, he touched people considered to be unclean. There were rules about lepers and other people who might have had bodily afflictions, that you weren't to touch them, you'd become unclean. Jesus didn't care. He loved them and he reached out to them. He forgave sinners, he dined with them. And of course the story we heard about today with this woman with the ointment who was criticized. Jesus came to her defense. So Jesus gives us this model of loving without boundaries. And sometimes that we set up boundaries, sometimes around race or culture, and we feel like we shouldn't go beyond we could sort of have like this little fence around ourselves, and we don't feel comfortable wandering beyond that fence. So we can love our family, we can love the people we know who are like us and share our interests and our values. But loving people kind of beyond that fence is a little harder for us to do. Loving people whose values are a little different, whose culture is different, whose ways we might not always agree with or understand. But that's what Jesus did. He went beyond the fence and loved everyone. And that's what he's calling us to do. And that's the lesson of dancing in the aisle, that this little girl didn't really care about whether or not people would be upset with her dancing in the aisle. She was doing it as her way of praising God and letting her heart just share the love she was feeling. The story about the little girl in the mall, a very similar thing where she didn't really care about whether it was appropriate or not. She just saw this little baby and she wanted to show him some love. So, discussion questions for you to think about. Recall a time when your heart urged you to do something spontaneous, but you resisted. What held you back? We've all had moments where maybe we thought we should have done something, reached out to somebody in some way, and maybe we were afraid or something prevented us from doing it. Take a moment to reflect on some of those times in your life. And then, second question, recall a time when you didn't hold back. What allowed you to follow your heart, and what happened? When are some of those times when you just reached out in love to another person, not really caring about the consequences, just knowing that you needed to show that love to them? And the third question here is, have you become more or less concerned about the opinion of others as you've grown in years? What factors have influenced your attitudes? You know, it's said that as we get older, sometimes we kind of return to that childhood innocence of not really caring about what other people think of us, right? We reach a point where we realize that that's not what's most important in life, not impressing others. That's not what we're here for. We're here to love God and to love other people as fully as we can. So maybe as you've grown older, I know it's true for me. As I've gotten older, I've been less concerned about impressing people or what they think of me, and try not to even think about that at all, and just say, well, okay, they don't like what I'm doing. I don't really care that much. It's not that important. I just need to follow my heart and do the things that I know and sense are right. So, don't always do that. Sometimes I still worry, but I find some freedom in getting older and not worrying so much about that. And maybe you do too. So, a lot to think about there. Remember the model Jesus gives us for loving, and let's all try to follow that model, follow our hearts, and love extravagantly. I'll be back again next week with another devotion from this book, and reflecting on some of the lessons that children teach us about our spiritual lives. Hope you have a great week, and hope to see you around, and hope you tune in again next week. God bless.